The church was quiet, the only sound the soft shuffle of mourners' shoes as they shifted in their seats. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and roses, the soft glow of stained glass windows casting colours across the stone floor. It should have been a peaceful setting, a place for remembrance, but today there was an uncomfortable stillness that weighed heavily on everyone present. The coffin at the front of the church was draped in flowers, a beautiful sight, but something was off. The priest, standing solemnly beside it, recited the prayers, his voice soft but steady. Yet as he spoke, there was an unspoken tension in the air, something Michael, sitting near the front, couldn't shake. The priest, usually a picture of calm, seemed distracted. His hands trembled slightly as he held the prayer book, and his eyes darted nervously to the dog sitting quietly by the coffin. The dog, a large, dark shepherd, was unusually still, its eyes locked on the coffin, its posture tense and alert. Michael couldn't help but notice the dog. It wasn't lying down or resting, as most dogs would in a setting like this. Instead, it sat stiffly, as though on high alert, watching everything around it with a sharp, unwavering gaze. The dog's presence seemed out of place, and Michael couldn't understand why it made him feel uneasy. The priest's voice wavered for just a second, and that was when the dog barked, loud and sudden, its sharp sound piercing through the quiet room like a crack of thunder. The mourners jumped in surprise, the bark so unexpected that it sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. The priest flinched, his face paling as he quickly glanced at the dog. His hands trembled slightly, and for a moment he seemed lost in thought, his gaze flicking nervously between the dog and the coffin. Michael's heart raced as he watched this exchange. Something wasn't right, and he felt it deep in his bones. The dog barked again, this time louder, more insistent. It wasn't just a random bark, it was a call, a warning, as if the dog knew something the rest of them didn't. Michael's eyes shifted from the dog to the priest. The priest, though still reciting the prayers, seemed distracted, his eyes darting nervously to the animal. The dog's body was taut with tension, its eyes fixed on the coffin. Michael's curiosity grew, and he leaned toward the elderly woman sitting beside him. "Why is the priest acting so strange?" he whispered. "What's happening?" The woman looked up at him, her face pale. She opened her mouth to speak, but didn't answer. Instead, she stared at the dog, her eyes wide with fear. Michael turned his attention back to the animal, his gaze lingering on it. There was something about the way it was staring at the coffin that sent a chill down his spine. Without warning, the dog let out another bark, this time more aggressive. Its body tensed, and Michael felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The room grew even quieter, the only sound now the deep growl coming from the dog. The priest's hands clenched around the prayer book, his knuckles white. Michael couldn't take it any longer. He stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving the dog. Something was wrong, and he had to know what it was. As he moved down the aisle toward the coffin, the dog's gaze followed him, its growl deepening. Michael's heart pounded in his chest. The priest's voice wavered again. "Please sit down," he said, softly, almost pleading. But Michael was already moving closer to the coffin, drawn by a force he couldn't explain. Michael stood frozen for a moment, his feet planted firmly on the church's cold stone floor. The dog's growl echoed through the church, deep and guttural, its eyes still locked on the coffin. There was an undeniable sense of urgency in its posture now, something more than just a protective instinct. The animal was sensing something, and whatever it was, it felt dangerously close. He turned back to the priest, whose face had gone completely pale. The man had been visibly sweating, but now he looked as if he were caught in the grip of something much worse than fear. His hands trembled so violently that the prayer book he held threatened to slip from his fingers. His gaze darted nervously between Michael and the dog, his lips pressed into a thin line, as if trying to hold back a flood of words he wasn't ready to say. "Father." Michael's voice cracked slightly, but he forced himself to speak. "What is it? Why is the dog so agitated?" The priest hesitated, his eyes shifting to the floor, unable or unwilling to meet Michael's gaze. The tension in the room was palpable, and Michael's heart raced with the increasing feeling that something was terribly wrong. The dog, still seated by the coffin, continued its low growl. The noise vibrated through Michael's chest, unsettling him in a way he couldn't explain. It wasn't just the bark anymore, it was the intensity, the urgency. This wasn't normal. Michael took a few tentative steps forward, his eyes never leaving the animal. The room felt impossibly still, as though the world outside had ceased to exist, leaving only this moment, this strange, oppressive moment, where the air seemed thick with secrets. As he took another step, the dog's growl deepened, rising in volume, and it bared its teeth, the muscles in its body taut with tension. The mourners in the room shifted uneasily, some muttering to each other, but no one moved to intervene. It was as if they were all waiting for someone to make sense of the strange situation. Michael's feet moved on their own, compelled by an unknown force. He reached the coffin and stood there for a moment, staring down at the flowers that adorned it. The fragrance of lilies filled the air, but it did nothing to calm the unease gnawing at him. He glanced back at the priest, who was now shaking his head, his mouth opening as though to speak, but no words came out. "Why?" Michael repeated, his voice stronger now, though it still trembled with uncertainty. "What's inside the coffin? Why is the dog acting like this?" The priest looked up, his eyes wide, his breath ragged. He opened his mouth, but the words that came were barely a whisper. "It's not supposed to be here. It was never meant to be here." Michael blinked, confusion and dread washing over him. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice almost shaking now. "What wasn't supposed to be here?" The priest stepped back, his face a mask of horror. It's a mistake," he stammered, his hands wringing the prayer book with frantic desperation. "A mistake that should have never happened." The dog's barking erupted again, sharp and loud, its body jerking as if it were about to spring into action. Michael turned his gaze back to the animal. There was something in its eyes now, something like recognition, a knowing that cut through the confusion and reached straight to the heart of the matter. As the dog's barking reached its peak, the coffin creaked. The sound was subtle at first, but it was enough to stop everyone in the room. A collective breath was held as the air grew thick with anticipation. Michael's eyes widened. Without warning, the dog sprang to its feet, its body moving with lightning speed. It barked again, louder than ever, its focus now completely on the coffin. Michael stepped back instinctively, his pulse quickening as the room seemed to spin in slow motion. The priest staggered backward, his face pale and filled with dread. Then, as the dog's growls reverberated through the room, a voice, almost a whisper, escaped the priest's lips. "You need to leave. It's not safe." Michael turned to face the priest, confusion clouding his thoughts. "What's going on?" he demanded. "What's in the coffin?" But the priest only shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. And as the dog barked one last time, its eyes never leaving the coffin, Michael realized that whatever secret was buried in that casket was about to be revealed. And it wasn't something anyone could have ever prepared for. Michael's heart pounded in his chest as he took one last step toward the coffin. The dog stood silently beside him, its eyes locked on the casket, still as stone. There was a strange stillness in the air, a heavy tension that made it feel like time had slowed to a crawl. Every muscle in Michael's body was tense, and he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The priest stood motionless, his face pale, his lips trembling, as though he were struggling to say something, anything. But the words didn't come. "Please, don't open it," the priest whispered, his voice barely audible. His hands gripped the prayer book so tightly that his knuckles were white. But Michael's curiosity had already taken hold. He had to know what was inside. With a final breath, he gripped the edge of the coffin lid and lifted it. The room seemed to hold its breath as the lid creaked open. For a long moment, there was nothing. Just the soft rustle of the dog's fur and the tense silence of the room. The coffin was empty. No body, no remains, just the dark interior of the wooden box. Michael stepped back, his eyes wide with disbelief. He turned to the priest, searching for an explanation, but the man had collapsed into a chair, his face covered in his hands. The dog, once tense, now relaxed. It sat quietly by Michael's side, its eyes softening, as if its purpose had been fulfilled. Michael's mind raced, the questions swirling in his head. The priest finally looked up, his voice breaking. "It wasn't supposed to be here," he murmured. "It was never meant to be opened." And with that, the mystery remained, unsolved, unfinished, leaving only questions in its wake.